My name is Claire McDonald, and I am the town archivist for the town of Garrett Park. I've been in this role since July 2019. Sorry. Um, can I start over?
Yeah, you can. Absolutely.
My name is Claire McDonald. I am the town archivist for the town of Garrett Park, Maryland. I've been in my role since July 2019, so about 3 years, and I'm the part-time archivist, so I'm here about 8 to 10 hours a week. As the town archivist, my role is to preserve, collect, research, and share the town history of Garrett Park. And we have a rich history. We're 125 years old. We have beautiful architecture in town. And so my role is to make sure people are aware of it. We're unique in that the town archives is part of Records Management Center. So I also handle the inactive records of the town office before they go to the Maryland State Archives. And we collect historical collections from individuals, former town residents, current town residents. So we have a really nice historical collection here as well. Garrett Park has an interesting history. We really are a train town. And although we were incorporated in 1898, our history really begins with the metropolitan branch of the B&O Railroad, which opened in 1873. And investors at that time were really thinking, how do you capitalize on this? And in 1886, a man by the name of Henry Kopp created the Metropolitan Investment and Building Company and got like-minded investors to start buying property. They bought 500 acres of land on both sides of the railroad, which eventually became Garrett Park. We really only developed about a third of that land on this side of the railroad tracks. But the idea was to entice people from Washington, D.C. who wanted to get out of the downtown area, come out to what was considered the highlands of Montgomery County and settle in Garrett Park. So by 1888, people started building homes here. By the early 1890s, we had a number of homes. We had a one-room schoolhouse. By the late 1890s, we had our chapel. But the big thing that then became the history of Garrett Park was in 1897, I believe it was, get my dates right, we had an individual by the name of Grace Spriggs bought a house in town, one of the Victorians, and she wanted to be radical and install an indoor toilet, a water closet, that was connected to an underground privy vault or cesspool. And at the time, typhoid was happening in the area, and so her neighbors were concerned that her underground privy tank would contaminate the water and lead to typhoid. But they really had nothing they could do about it because we weren't an incorporated town. So then the town residents got the idea. They went to the Maryland General Assembly, and in April of 1898, the Maryland General Assembly passed an act to incorporate the town of Garrett Park, giving them full privileges to conduct elections, to write ordinances, and to enforce them. And so on May 4th, we held our first election in Garrett Park. And one of the first things the new town leaders did was to pass a sanitation ordinance and to try to shut down Grace Spriggs' underground privy vault or cesspool. They had 2 years of legal battles, and ultimately the town of Garrett Park won. Interestingly, not because they were right about the risk of contamination, but because the courts upheld that now that they were an incorporated town, they could write their own ordinances and enforce them. So that's our kind of fun, quirky history, and we've been quirky ever since. I think it's around 325 to 400, but I would have to double check that number.
That's right. That was just a question I was thinking. All right. So you said that this is the 125th anniversary of the town. How is the town commemorating the milestone anniversary?
Since May is really our birthday month, On May 21st, we held an event. It was an event sponsored by the Archives Committee and the Town Archives. And our idea was we wanted to bring the archives to the people. So instead of having residents come here and see what cool things we have in our collections, we brought the archives to our town hall and set up exhibits to tell the story of Garrett Park through the decades. And so we had the early papers of the appointments of our first health sanitation officer, the first marshal. We have the original town meeting minutes from the town council in 1898. And we brought that all with us, and we set up tables and exhibits. We had a wonderful barbershop quartet with a gentleman from town. His barbershop quartet sang. We had snacks, not with the archive materials, but in another room. We had activities for the children, and it was so wonderful to see families come out, all ages, and it was their opportunity not just to read and look at exhibits, but pick things up and touch them and really engage in history in a different way. So we were really happy with how the event went. We don't have an exact head count, but probably over the 4 hours we had this event, it was 100 or more people came in to explore. Our archives, the town archives has an interesting history in that, similar to the history of the town, the archives really began in the 1960s. We had a town clerk at the time by the name of Sybil Griffin who understood that it was probably important to start collecting and preserving. At that time, the town did not have a town office, so many of the original records of the town were actually in people's homes. And Sybil Griffin went around collecting those, going into people's basements, maybe going into their attics, bringing all those records in. She also started keeping her own documentation of that. And so in a lot of ways, that was the beginning of our town archive. But then more formally, in 2003, a woman by the name of Barbara Scheidler became the first paid archivist for the town and started compiling, organizing, indexing what we had. And she was in that role until 2009. When she retired, the mayor appointed an archives committee to advise him on what's the path forward. And it was a wonderful collection of volunteers who really were invested in telling the history of the town. Many of the materials in this room, that group is responsible for organizing, boxing properly, and preserving. And they started using a paid town archivist or a contract archivist in about 2012. And so since that time, Garrett Park has had a contract archivist like myself in this role. What I find most rewarding about my job as the town archivist is I play a couple different roles.
Well, wait,
I'm
hold on.
okay, yeah.
Wait till they finish moving the table.
That would be
and
moving the
chairs.
tables and chairs. Yes, it's even fun when the train goes by as well.
Do we know what time that happens?
No, I'm never quite sure.
All right, let's do that again.
Okay.
Do you need me to re-ask the question?
No, I can. One of the things I find really rewarding as the town archivist is I wear a couple different hats, or I play different roles. I help the mayor and the town council and the town office to provide historical context to today's issues. So many of the problems or questions that come up, if it has to do with maybe storm drains or streets and roads or decisions that were made about this building or town hall, I have records here in the archives, and so I'm able to provide that historical context as they're making decisions that impact people today. I also I'm open to residents of town to come in and do research. So people will often come in to look at the house files, or maybe they're interested in an individual who used to live here, and so I'll contribute to that of having people come in be able to do research. And it's not just town residents. I've had academics come in. I've had local news media come and use our resources if they're researching a story. Genealogists, while I don't have vital records or those types of materials, I do have sometimes small information about if your family member was on our town council or a mayor. I'll have some biographical information I can share. One of our best collections, and probably one of our most popular collections, is the house collection. We have files on every single house in Garrett Park. Now, some of the files are very thin, but some are very thick. And Garrett Park has a rich architectural history. So we have some of the original Victorians. We have the bungalow-style Chevy houses. We have mid-century modern, the modular-style tech-built houses, and more contemporary houses. And so people want to come in and not only learn the architectural history of their house, but our house files will tell you who lived there. So for the Victorians, who were the first owners in 1887 or 1889? And you can learn a little bit of history. Many of our town residents, if they do remodeling in their house, they will donate photographs, and so you can see what remodeling was done in your house. Or sometimes people will submit stories, and so it's you never quite know what you're going to find in the house files. So that's definitely one of our most popular. The other is our photograph files. We have thousands of photographs, both print photographs as well as digital. And so if you want a history of our 4th of July parades, we have photographs from that. We have photographs of almost every building, including the houses in town and other events that have happened. So it's a wonderful collection. And then probably the other popular one is our oral history collection. Dating back to the 1970s, we have over 150 oral histories, and it just tells an interesting story about, what were activities children were doing in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, or what was the development of the town, what were some of the hot issues that early leaders were having to deal with. And so the oral histories just cover literally thousands of topics. One of my favorite parts of our collection is what's called the Galloway collection. It's the original photographs of the town of Garrett Park. We don't have a lot of those. And in 2012, a descendant of an early town resident, Beverly T. Galloway, who was a plant pathologist, a descendant of Galloway contacted the archives and said, I have a bunch of original photographs of the town. And they donated the digital copies to us. We've since had some reprints made, but it shows some of the first Victorian houses being built, what the roads looked like. There was a lack of trees, so it's really shocking to see these photographs. There's wonderful photographs of this building, Penn Place, what we now call Penn Place. The building of Town Hall, or the old St. James Chapel. So that is by far my favorite collection. Anybody who comes in the archives, I love to show them that collection. I mentioned our oral histories are another wonderful collection, and all of them have been digitized, so they're no longer just on cassette tapes. We actually have MP3s, so you can listen to them as well, and most of them have been transcribed, and so we have the print transcriptions. Another favorite of mine is the St. James Chapel collection. It's what people know as our town hall on Kenilworth, but originally it was a chapel, and it was built in 1897, and the collection actually has the original minutes on the building of this, so the deliberations of should we build it? Where will we buy the land? How much will the land be? We have original proposals from the contractors. to build it. So we know how much it cost and what the different components were. And it's just a very fun collection to read, to learn, that things back in the 1890s were not so much different than some of the decisions you have to make today when you're building a new building. So those are my two favorites.
Working on.
There's always something going on in the town archives. I could probably work full-time plus and still not stay up with everything that I would like to do in the archives. One of our big projects for this year is with our oral histories. I want to create just a small listening station. So people can always come in and request to look at a transcription. But what I like to do in our archives is set up a space where somebody can sit at the table, put some headphones on, and actually hear people tell their story. We have a lot of second, third generation family members living in Garrett Park. So to be able to come in and listen to your grandfather or great-grandfather or great-grandmother tell their story, I think would just be an amazing addition. And I'm hoping to have that up and running by the end of the summer or early fall. Another project I've been working on is early Garrett Park actually had a fairly sizable population of Black residents, and we don't really tell their story fully. And so I've been working with some other residents of town to identify who were some of our early Black residents and how do we tell their story. I have biographical files on early town leaders, and I want to do something similar for the early Black residents of our town. And then there's a lot of behind the scenes things that people don't think about in archives. We have a cataloging system that has over 10,000 records in it. We're working to upgrade that. Again, it's part of making things discoverable and usable for researchers, but also to ensure that on the back end, we're preserving our records and we have a way to keep track of everything we have. Where is it at? What condition is it in? So those are probably my three top projects for the summer. Much of our archives is based on materials that have been donated from town residents or former town residents, and we welcome donations. And so if you're interested in donating to the archive, I recommend that you first start on the town's website. The Archives Committee has a page, and it describes the type of materials we're interested in. For example, I have a lot of materials from the 1950s, but not a lot of materials from the 20s or 30s. Early photographs are always welcome. If you check our town website, the Archives Committee has a page, and it describes the type of materials that we're interested in receiving. We have a lot of materials from the 1950s, but materials from the 20s or 30s, or even the 60s, 70s, 80s. We'd definitely be interested in having photographs, especially old photographs of the town, are always welcome. If possible, identify who's in them. Don't write on your photographs, but if you can identify. One of the collections I've really been trying to build is our baseball collection. Garrett Park had an active youth baseball team in the 50s and 60s, and I've been trying to build that collection. But certainly, I'm always interested in talking to people if they have something they'd like to donate. And so if you email me at archives@garrettparkmd.gov, I'm happy to chat with you about what materials you may have.
Great. Say your email one more time for me.
If you email us at archives@garrettparkmd.gov, we'd love to hear from you. Currently, we are not doing oral histories. Members of the town have talked about doing it. It's a huge project to undertake. And so my main priority was to really get a handle on the 150 oral histories we do have. I recently created an oral history catalog that includes brief biographies of each of the historians. It has a topic or subject index, and it also has a person index. But Our archives committee has definitely talked about possibly doing more oral histories in the future. And who knows, as technology has changed, maybe we'll go beyond oral histories and think about something such as video histories. So definitely some opportunity there, but we need to really think it through before we do it. Like any archive, one of the things we're always thinking about is how do we best preserve the materials we have. Our archive is located in a historic building, and so probably our number one challenge is environmental control, temperature and humidity, and a lot of archives that are in historic buildings. The town of Garrett Park has been wonderful in working with me to give me separate environmental controls so I can adjust the temperature, try to keep it at a steady 66 to 67 degrees. Humidity is a constant issue, and so I'm always, I monitor our humidity. The big thing I'm going for is to avoid wild fluctuations. That definitely will put stress and strain on our materials. It can lead to moisture problems and eventually mold or mildew. But then the more modern issues I deal with are my digitized materials. People will often ask, when are you going to digitize everything in this room? And the answer to that is probably never, because digitizing is a whole additional complicated area to think about, because then I've essentially created a second collection that I need to preserve my digital materials, but I also need to preserve my original paper materials. So I'm very selective about what I digitize. And when I do, I'm always looking at what are my backups so that I'm not losing my digital materials. But then I need to periodically look at my formats, my file formats. I mentioned the oral histories. They're currently in an MP3 format. That's an old format now. So one of my projects I need to consider is, will I be updating to a newer format? So there's always these preservation kind of challenges. Periodically, I'll get a unique donation, whether it's an old newspaper or a textile, that I have other special preservation considerations I need to make. There's a wonderful group of archivists and historians in Montgomery County who I very often will reach out to and get advice on how are you doing things, and we'll compare ideas. The difference between a historical society and a town archives is, so our town archives here in Garrett Park is, I do get official town records from the town office, and there's a whole legal component to that. And so I work with the town office to ensure we're complying with Maryland state law. We have a records retention schedule for those records. So they're considered inactive records of the town. The town, still owns those records, and the Maryland State Archives ultimately will receive many of those records. But then I have this other component of the historical records, and that makes me more like a historical society, where they're records that have been donated by private individuals or organizations and that contribute to the history of the town. And those I still have standards I follow, and documentation I keep. I obtain donor forms, but those aren't covered under the same laws that the town records are for the state of Maryland. My name is Claire McDonald. I am the town archivist for the town of Garrett Park. I've been in my role since July 2019.
One more time.
Excellent.
Just kind of lean forward a little
Oh,
bit
okay.
more. Yeah, you got ready. 3, 2, 1.
My name is Claire McDonald. I am the town archivist for the town of Garrett Park, Maryland. I've been in my position since July 2019. This was my favorite place when I was, still dating my significant other. We would come here because he knew I liked the train. It was before I even knew Garrett Park had an archive.
Oh, okay.
But we would sit up at Black Market Bistro and
that's
be
cool.
like, look, the train.
Right.
One of my other favorite collections or item that we have in the archive is what I have next to me. This is a World War II Roll of Honor of the gentlemen, and it was men at the time, of Garrett Park who fought in World War II. And what I find so special about this is this was created in 1944, but I also, in the archive, I have a photograph of this actually being dedicated. And at that dedication, the town mayor, Frank Weaver, gave a beautiful speech to dedicate the honor roll, recognize not just the contributions of the men who served, but everybody in Garrett Park who supported the war effort. So I really considered this one of the gems of our collection and tried to share it with people when they come in. One of my other favorite items in our archive is our World War II Roll of Honor. This was created in 1944 to recognize residents of Garrett Park who fought in World War II. And what's so neat about this item is not only do we have the original, but I have a photograph of it being dedicated on July 4th, 1944. And the mayor at the time, Frank Weaver, gave a lovely speech to recognize not just the men of Garrett Park who fought in World War II, but also other town residents who supported the war effort. So it really is, I consider, one of the gems of our collection.